Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Kari Moody channel this evening. There's a case I would like to go over with everybody. I'm still not ballsy enough yet to go live, so let's do a premiere. Also, I'm still learning StreamYard, so let me get to where we need to go. All right. So this happened in Walker County, Alabama. And this was on January 13th. So, Walker County Sheriff's deputies have arrested a man wanted for attempted murder. On Thursday, they received a call from a concerned family member of a Carbon Hill man. The caller stated that Anthony Tony Mitchell, 33, of Carbon Hill had made statements insinuating that he may harm himself or others. Deputies responded to the scene to perform a welfare check on him. And when the deputies arrived, they say they saw Mitchell in the front yard of the residence. They say he immediately pulled out a handgun and fired at least one shot at deputies before running into some nearby woods. Immediately, a SWAT unit, patrol, narcotics, and investigative divisions, Sheriff Smith, and others were en route to the scene. Law enforcement eventually found Mitchell in a shed in the woods. During the investigation, deputies also recovered methamphetamine, heroin, and a handgun from the location. And when this happened, the Walker County Sheriff's Office posted on its Facebook page saying the situation could have ended much differently if it weren't for the constant training of our department, incredible work by our dispatchers, assistance from other agencies, and the quick help of District Attorney Bill Adair's office. Thankfully, the day ended with everyone safe. But as you can see from the title of this video, this man was not safe. This is from the Miami Herald on February 14th, 2023. And the guy you see there is Anthony Mitchell, 33. That is the same guy that is right here. Same guy. So, a man arrested during a welfare check spent his final days in hellish conditions inside an Alabama jail cell before his internal body temperature drastically dropped and he froze to death, a new federal lawsuit says. His family accuses jail officials of restraining Tony Mitchell, 33, and placing him inside of a walk in freezer or a similar frigid environment as punishment at the Walker County Jail and leaving him there for hours before he died on January 26th, according to a wrongful death lawsuit filed on February 13th by his mother. And I do have that complaint that I'd like to go over with you. This case raises an appalling question. How does a man literally freeze to death while incarcerated in a modern climate controlled jail in the custody and care of corrections officers? A complaint says. While Mitchell's autopsy report hasn't been released yet, an ER doctor who spent more than 3 hours trying to resuscitate him wrote in his medical records that it was tough to understand how his internal body temperature dropped to 72 degrees while in police custody. I do believe that hypothermia was the ultimate cause of his death, the ER doctor wrote. Margaret Mitchell, Mitchell's mother, is suing Walker County Sheriff Nick Smith, who was present during his arrest and detention, several corrections officers employed by the sheriff's office, 2 nurses, and an investigator with the sheriff's office. She accuses them of causing her son's death. McClatchy News contacted the sheriff's office and the jail for comment on February 14th and didn't immediately receive a response. John Goldfarb, the lead Birmingham-based attorney on the case, said in a statement to McClatchy News that evidence of the abuse Mitchell endured in jail would have been buried if it weren't for the bravery of a lone corrections officer. That corrections officer shared videos of Mitchell's treatment inside the jail, and she was fired for exposing the truth. One of the videos the officer shared shows Mitchell being dragged out of his holding cell naked and being tased by one officer while others watched on January 15th. The former correction officer who shared the videos, Karen Kelly, is also suing the Walker County Sheriff's Office over her firing following Mitchell's death. The lawsuit describes Mitchell as a man struggling with drug addiction, which worsened after his father died in late 2022. On January 12th, Mitchell needed to go to the hospital, but was instead locked naked in a bare isolation cell, described as a dog kennel, lacking a mattress, blanket, and toilet, according to the complaint. This day, Mitchell arrived at his cousin's house disheveled, emaciated, and in a delusional state, and he said he needed to go inside the house in order to find a box that held the remains of his baby brother, who had been stillborn. Mitchell's claims about his baby brother's body being in a box inside his cousin's house were not true. Now, Mitchell's cousin soon realized he direly needed psychiatric help and eventually called 911 after trying to contact the Walker County Sheriff's Department. Ultimately, deputies responded for a welfare check, and they found Mitchell in the front yard with a handgun before he fired a shot toward them and ran away into the nearby woods. After deputies tracked him down, he was booked into jail on attempted murder charges. During Mitchell's 14 days of incarceration, the corrections officers are accused of standing by and not stopping Mitchell's abuse, acting indifferent toward his urgent medical needs, failing to get him treatment, and covering up what happened. These actions were captured on jail surveillance footage. Several screenshots of the footage are included in the complaint, and we'll see those. The Mitchell's attorney called it the worst case of inmate abuse I have ever seen. 3 days after Mitchell was placed in the isolated jail cell, naked, he was tased for an unspecified reason, causing his false teeth to fall out on January 15th. Mitchell lost his teeth due to years of drug abuse and personal neglect and was wearing that set of false teeth when he was arrested. The officers never gave Mitchell his teeth back, and they sealed him in a property bag that was later given to his mother after he died. The bag, dated January 15th, shows his false teeth remained in that bag since then. As a result, Mitchell possibly had trouble eating jail food, according to the complaint. At one point, Mitchell's cousin received a call from an officer saying that Mitchell was refusing to eat. Now, I can imagine without his teeth, he probably had one hell of a time eating while in jail. And there is the picture of them. Based on his unexplained hypothermia, Mitchell's family believes that during the evening of January 25th to the 26th, Mitchell was likely strapped in a restraint chair, put in the jail's kitchen's walk-in freezer as a potential punishment for allegedly shooting at deputies when he was arrested. Jail footage shared by the former corrections officer shows him being brought back to his cell around 4 a.m., when two correctional officers are seen laughing and smiling as Mitchell lies motionless and naked on the dirty cement floor, clearly needing medical help. And this is a screenshot of the video that was recorded that morning. You can see Mitchell in there on the floor. His attorney said that this particular video will haunt him forever. At the end of this video, Mitchell raises his head and looks to the deputies before they close his cell door and shut off the lights. By 6 a.m., jail staff were indifferent to Mitchell, who lay dying of hypothermia, the video shows, according to the complaint. While Tony languished naked and dying of hypothermia in the early morning hours of January 26th, and his chances for survival trickled away, numerous corrections officers and medical staff wandered over to his open cell door to spectate and be entertained by his condition. Any of these individuals could have saved his life by calling 911 and summoning an ambulance. No one did. At around 8:30 a.m., Mitchell is dragged out of his cell, placed in shackles, and eventually brought to the hospital. According to the complaint, which argues that his heart stopped beating by the time he arrived at Walker Baptist Hospital. The lawsuit accuses the sheriff's communications of lying in a statement shared with news outlets, saying that Mitchell was alert and conscious after a routine medical check when he was brought to the hospital. Officials have not released any other details regarding the circumstances of Mitchell's condition in custody or his death. The Alabama Law Enforcement Agency is now investigating the death following a request from the sheriff's office. When the investigation is completed, the findings will be given to the Walker County DA's office. We think this case will only become more horrifying as the full facts come to life. The case comes a few months after another federal lawsuit was filed over how an Alabama man told officers that he was experiencing a medical emergency outside of a Dollar General store and was put in Geneva County Jail, and he too later died.
No justice, no peace. I'm ashamed of Walker County. I'm ashamed.
Protesting
It took
the
until I
death.
saw the poster that said "Rest in Peace, Tony Mitchell" until it hit me and my heart just fell.
Many mourning the recent death of 33-year-old Tony Mitchell.
We used to play basketball in a barn together every day after high school.
Friends, family, even strangers wanting justice for his death.
We want justice.
Something I think in all of us just snapped. We had heard that he had passed away, but it's so much different when you see how inhumanely he was treated.
Help me more.
Mitchell was arrested by the Walker County Sheriff's Office on January 12th and died just 2 weeks later.
Seeing a man that I grew up with and I can remember playing basketball and laughing with, seeing him drag across the frozen floor lifeless, it just changed something in my heart.
A lawsuit alleges he died from hypothermia after being placed inside a freezer at the jail.
The only thing they know to do is throw you in a cell and make a lesson out of you, I guess is what they're trying to do here.
Just
now people
horrific.
are calling for change.
Go forward, there has to be some kind of change.
The first and foremost thing is that there be justice for the Mitchell family.
Justice for Tony!
In our minds, that includes the immediate resignation of Sheriff Nick Smith and TJ Armstrong for their deceitful actions and the way that they have hurt our community. And of course, the administrative leave of all personnel who are involved, whether that means actively involved or they've just stood by while it happened.
I'm very sad for this family, and our hearts go out to every one of them. It's been a long time coming, and we pray for justice. We pray to God that God's hands is in this and that it will stop.
Do the right thing.
Now, people are also calling for the release of body camera and jail surveillance footage. I reached out to the county attorneys for a response.
All right, so let's go over this complaint. I hope you guys have time. I feel like this is just so important. The way that he was treated is it's atrocious. So this is the complaint. His mom is suing the sheriff's department, a nurse practitioner there, a nurse, an investigator, and so on. And so it reads, this is one of the most appalling cases of jail abuse the country has seen. On the night of January 25th to 26th, 2023, Anthony Don Mitchell, Tony, froze to death while incarcerated at the Walker County Jail. This case raises an appalling question. How does a man literally freeze to death while incarcerated in a modern climate-controlled jail in the custody and care of corrections officers? The case provides contrasting examples of both the worst of humanity and also its best. Without the malice, deliberate indifference, and failure to intervene of nearly a dozen correction officers at the jail, and the cooperation of these officers and their superiors in a scheme to deprive Tony of his civil rights, and ultimately of his life. Tony could never have been killed, likely by being placed in a restraint chair in the jail kitchen's walk-in freezer or similar frigid environment and left there for hours. Nor would he have been denied the prompt emergency medical treatment that would have saved him after his removal from that frigid place. But also, without the heroism of a corrections officer who dared to preserve security camera footage on her phone and get the recordings to the estate, it would have been impossible for the estate to dismantle the scheme of silence and lies within the sheriff's department and reconstruct what happened to Tony on the morning of January 26, 2023. Although the medical examiner has not yet released the autopsy report, It is clear that Tony's death was wrongful, the result of horrific, malicious abuse and mountains of deliberate indifference. While Tony languished naked and dying of hypothermia in the early morning hours of January 26th, and his chances for survival trickled away, numerous corrections officers and medical staff wandered over to his open cell door to spectate and be entertained by his condition, as shown by the surveillance camera screenshots that are included in this complaint. Any of these individuals could have saved his life by calling 911 and summoning an ambulance. No one did. Instead, corrections officers and their commanding officers worked together in a scheme to conceal the horrific abuse, delaying medical treatment for 5 hours, long enough to ensure Tony did not survive to tell the story of what happened to him. The estate brings us action for redress against the corrections officers who, through their abuse of Tony, caused his death. They bring suit against the corrections officers who failed to intervene to prevent and stop that abuse. Bring suit against the corrections officers and jail medical personnel who were deliberately indifferent to Tony's serious medical needs and who failed to summon an ambulance or otherwise obtain the urgent emergency medical treatment he so obviously needed. Finally, the estate brings suit against the officials, including the sheriff and his communications officer, who ratified these other defendants' violations of Tony's constitutional rights and who also themselves actively participated in the scheme to hide and perpetuate the horrific abuse Tony suffered. As alleged below, this scheme began hours before doctors declared Tony dead, at a time when it was still possible to save his life. Now, this just goes over jurisdiction and venue. We are not going to go over all of that. The party is Margaret Mitchell's his mother, and it lets you know again who all she is suing in this. Now, the statement of facts. Anthony Don Mitchell, known to his family as Tony, was a 33-year-old man with a history of drug addiction. He was also a beloved son and brother. Up until late 2022, Tony lived with his father at a house on Lost Creek Road, Carbon Hill. Tony's father died in late 2022. After his father's death, Tony lived alone in the house. Tony's mother, Margaret Mitchell, paid his power and water bills and dropped off food for him. After the death of his father, in a story familiar to so many Americans, Tony appears to have spiraled into worsening drug addiction, and his physical and mental health precipitously declined. Tony passed away on January 26, 2023, at Walker Baptist Medical Center while in the custody of the Walker County Sheriff's Department. He died after spending 14 days incarcerated under hellish conditions as a pretrial detainee at the Walker County Jail from January 12th to January 26th. Tony's internal body temperature was 72 degrees Fahrenheit when he arrived at Walker Baptist Hospital in the back seat of his sheriff's vehicle on the morning of January 26th, brought there by sheriff's deputies who did not even bother to call an ambulance for him, despite his obvious need for emergency medical treatment. The emergency room physician who treated Tony and spent over 3 hours trying to resuscitate him wrote the following note in Tony's medical records. I am not sure what circumstances the patient was held in incarceration, but it is difficult to understand a rectal temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit while someone is incarcerated in jail. The cause of his hypothermia is not clear. It is possible he had an underlying medical condition resulting in hypothermia. I do not know if he could have been exposed to a cold environment. I do believe that hypothermia was the ultimate cause of his death. The last member of Tony's family to interact with him that day that he was arrested was Steve Mitchell, his cousin. On January 12, 2023, Tony showed up at Steve's house. Now, Steve had last seen his cousin 3 months before at the time of Tony's father's burial. Steve didn't initially recognize the man who appeared at his house. Tony, who was 6'3" or 4", had previously weighed around 240 pounds. Now, Steve at first took Tony for an old man, Tony was haggard and emaciated, weighing no more than 140 or 150 pounds. Wearing socks but no shoes, Tony informed Steve that he wanted to tell him a secret no one else knew. Obviously delusional, Tony told Steve that he, Tony, had a brother who had been stillborn, which was true. Tony further told Steve that his parents had put the baby brother's body in a box that was hidden in the attic of his house, which was not true and was delusional. Tony believed that he needed to tear out a wall in the attic so he could find the box his baby brother's body was in. Tony further believed there were two portals in his house, one to heaven and one to hell. Tony believed that he needed to put the box with his baby brother's body in the portal to heaven so his baby brother could go there. Steve realized immediately that his cousin, having lost around 100 pounds from his healthy weight, having lived evidently in complete isolation during recent months, and spouting delusions about portals to heaven and portals to hell, was in serious need of psychiatric help. This was not the Tony that Steve knew and loved. Not wanting to let Tony out of his sight, Steve agreed to go with Tony to Tony's house and help him look for the box. At the house, Tony continued to be delusional. Even after Steve and Steve's adult son Jacob climbed up into the attic with him and showed Tony that the box wasn't there, Tony insisted that the box with his baby brother's remains was hidden behind an exterior wall that he needed to tear out. Steve and Jacob left Tony at the house, promising to return and help Tony find the portal. Steve, not knowing how else to get help for his cousin, attempted to contact the Walker County Sheriff's Department. When he couldn't reach anyone at the Sheriff's Department, Steve eventually decided he had no choice but to call 911. Steve asked the 911 dispatcher if they could send someone to go check on his cousin. He told the dispatcher that Tony was talking out of his head about portals to heaven and hell, and that he appeared to be having a mental breakdown and that he was in an extremely degraded condition. The dispatcher asked if an ambulance was needed, and Steve told her that would be a good idea. When the sheriff's officers arrived at Tony's house on Lost Creek Road, they encountered Tony in the same obviously delusional and psychotic state that Steve had experienced earlier that afternoon. A written statement released from the sheriff's office on Facebook states, in part, when deputies arrived, they observed Mitchell in the front yard of the residence. Mitchell immediately brandished a handgun and fired at least one shot at deputies before retreating into a wooded area behind his home. More officers arrived, including the SWAT team, and Tony was eventually arrested in the woods behind his home. A picture posted by the sheriff's department, reportedly within minutes of Tony's arrest, shows Tony with his face apparently covered with black spray paint. And that is the picture we saw earlier. The defendant, the sheriff, was personally at the scene, supervising Tony's detention and arrest. Likewise, the defendant, TJ Armstrong, who was a public information officer for the sheriff's office, was also personally at the scene. In close proximity to Tony at the time of his arrest, Armstrong took the photo of Tony being apprehended and posted it from his phone at the scene to the sheriff department Facebook page. Within hours, the picture of Tony with his face spray painted black spread across social media. Steve Mitchell, Tony's cousin, was also at the scene with Tony's mother, Margaret Mitchell, at the time of his arrest. After Tony's arrest, Steve spoke with defendant Armstrong. Armstrong told him that Tony was alive, although a little roughed up, that he'd taken a shot at the officers and they were planning to charge him. At the time of his arrest, Tony suffered from serious medical and psychiatric needs, including but not limited to severe drug addiction, psychosis, and malnourishment. Armstrong and every other officer at the scene were consciously aware of Tony's serious medical needs. Showing this, Armstrong told Steve that they were going to set Tony's bond high enough that he would not be able to bond out, and assured Steve that Tony would receive medical evaluation and treatment in jail. Armstrong told him, "We're going to detox him, and then we'll see how much of his brain is left," or words to that effect. After observing Tony in a sheriff's department vehicle with what appeared to be black residue on his face, Steve asked defendant Armstrong why his face looked like that. Armstrong and every other officer at the scene were consciously aware of Tony's serious medical need for acute psychiatric treatment. Showing this, Armstrong told Steve that Tony had informed the deputies that he had spray painted his own face black because he was planning to enter a portal to hell located inside his house. Tony was housed as a pretrial detainee at the Walker County Jail from January 12th until his death on January 26th. For the duration of his stay at the jail, Tony was kept in an isolation cell in the booking area. These cells are not intended for housing of detainees, but rather are meant to hold detainees temporarily during the booking process. The cell lacked a bed or other furnishings. There was only a drain in the floor that could be used as a toilet. The cell was bare cement, the equivalent of a dog kennel. But unlike a dog, Tony was not even given a mat to sleep on. Tony had no cloth uniform, possibly as a result of the jail's suicide watch protocol. In every video clip on which he appears during his incarceration until deputies at last dress him in a jail uniform just prior to transporting him to the hospital on January 26, Tony appears completely naked. As a result of years of methamphetamine abuse and personal neglect, Tony had lost his teeth, and he used a set of false teeth to eat. He was wearing the teeth at the time of his arrest. Without his teeth, he would have been unable to chew solid food effectively. And let's go back to, there's his teeth that were basically taken from him. Well, they weren't taken from him, but he was tased and his teeth fell out shortly after he got to jail. And then he never did get him back. One of the first video clips that the estate's lawyers have of Tony, thanks to the heroism of the corrections officer who wanted her family and the public to know what happened to him, shows Tony naked, being dragged out of holding cell number 5, likely on or around January 15th, and tased by Braxton Key. Key is still inside the cell and not yet visible in the screenshot below. So here you can see Tony and some of the officers. The corrections officer in the black shirt supervising the tasing is Captain Alicia Jotty Tidwell. The tasing caused Tony's false teeth to pop out. Instead of being returned to Tony, the teeth were evidently recovered and placed by deputies in a property bag. After Tony's death, his mother received the teeth in a sealed property bag bearing a date of 1/15/2023, indicating that Tony's teeth were placed in the bag by jail personnel on that date. After January 15, 2023, to the extent he was provided solid food at the jail, Tony would not have been able to chew it effectively. Another clip shows Braxton Key and Morgan Madison dragging Tony from the shower located in a bathroom in the booking area. So, boy, it's just horrible. I'll give you guys just a second to look at that picture. This is just absolutely atrocious. Tony continued to suffer from serious medical and psychiatric needs while incarcerated as a pretrial detainee at the jail. These needs were obvious to every corrections officer and all jail personnel who came into contact with him. Defendant Armstrong, the sheriff's communications officer and his authorized agent for making statements to the public, provided a statement to news media regarding Tony's death, quoting in part as follows. On Thursday, January 27th, an inmate in the Walker County Jail was provided a routine medical check by jail medical staff. Medical staff determined the inmate needed to be transported to the hospital for further evaluation. The inmate was alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital. Shortly after arrival at the hospital, the inmate suffered a medical emergency and became unresponsive. Life-saving efforts were performed by hospital staff, and the inmate was ultimately revived. Unfortunately, a short time later, the inmate passed away. End quote. This statement is false, as Tony was not alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital. Tony was declared dead on Thursday, January 26 at 1:15 p.m. at Walker Baptist Medical Center. At some point that day, Steve Mitchell, Tony's cousin who had called 911, received a call from Defendant Armstrong, who was at the hospital with Tony. Armstrong told Steve that for the last week and a half, we've had a time with Tony. Armstrong told Steve that Tony had refused to eat. I wonder why he had no teeth. That he had refused to speak with jail personnel, and that he had allegedly refused to consent to a psychiatric evaluation. Armstrong described an incident when Tony had allegedly thrown feces at jail personnel. Armstrong further told Steve that it was the worst case of addiction we've ever seen, end quote. Showing that Armstrong was aware that Tony had been hypothermic prior to his transportation to the jail, Armstrong told Steve that Tony's body temperature had started dropping that morning and that they'd had to carry him to the hospital. The only way for Tony's body temperature to have started dropping to 72 degrees in such a short period of time was for him to have been placed in a restraint chair in the jail kitchen's walk-in freezer or similar frigid environment and left there for hours. Armstrong asked Steve to carry Tony's mother to the hospital because, in Armstrong's words, Tony's not going to live. Armstrong also falsely told Steve that when deputies got Tony to the hospital, the doctor had asked Tony to sit up, and Tony had sat up, and that at this point he had a massive heart attack, but that for now they were keeping him alive. Contrary to the statement Armstrong issued to the press, Tony was not alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital. If you guys missed that video clip I played earlier, please go back and watch it. So a video clip from the jail security camera system shows jail transport officers Jeremy Farley and Richard Holzman carrying Tony's limp body into a garage area at the jail on the morning of January 26, 2023, while Benjamin Shoemaker and Dayton Wakefield assist them with opening and closing doors. No medical personnel appear in this portion of the security camera footage. Clearly, in no hurry, Farley and Holzman move without urgency as they carry Tony through a doorway into the loading and unloading area. Tony is not handcuffed. Ahead of them, Benjamin Shoemaker opens the rear door of Sheriff's Department prisoner transport SUV. The deputies carry Tony with one on either side, each holding him by the jail uniform at the shoulder and hips. Tony's shackled legs remain bent in the air. I mean, does he look alert and conscious to any of you? Just one person. You can see his ankles are shackled. Just let me know if you think that he is possibly conscious and alert, as the officers have stated. As the deputies near the SUV, they lay Tony on the ground beside the SUV, letting the head fall back on the cement while they stand around, seeming to deliberate how best to place the body in the vehicle. Tony lies between them on the cement floor next to the SUV's open rear passenger door as the deputies confer. Here he's conscious and alert, laying on the concrete floor while they all look at him, wondering what in the hell are we going to do now? Allegedly. The deputies lift Tony's body and place it, still in the same bent seated position, across the back seat of the sheriff's department SUV. The deputies appear to push the body into the SUV, adjusting its position before closing the door. Again, moving with no particular urgency, the deputies walk around to get into the SUV and the clip ends. This video clip captured events that took place at around 8:55 a.m. on January 26th, after Tony had languished for 5 hours or more on a bare cement floor as his life trickled away, to the complete indifference of numerous corrections officers and medical staff, as explained in greater detail below. Dr. Timothy Jordan, the ER provider, made the following note that is contained in Tony's medical records. It says, "I have limited information on this patient other than was provided by the sheriff's deputies that accompanied the patient to the hospital. I was told by one of the deputies that the patient has been incarcerated since January 12th. I was also told by the deputies that the patient has not been eating or drinking for several days. He was brought to the emergency room by the sheriff deputies in a car for evaluation. One of our nurses noticed the sheriff's moving the patient out of the vehicle and putting him in a wheelchair, and he went outside and offered to move him to a stretcher. At that point, he was noted to have agonal respirations, breathing 2 to 4 times a minute. He was rushed into the ER and moved to our stretcher. He was unresponsive, apneic, and pulseless, and cold to the touch. CPR was started and handcuffs were removed. His mother arrived in the emergency room about 3.5 hours into resuscitation and gave additional history. She said her son has been drug addicted for years. He had developed multiple abscesses. He has been suicidal. He has recently been confused. She has not heard from him in weeks. She requested that we not continue resuscitation." Another note in the file states that during the attempted resuscitation, quote, "patient was unresponsive, but occasionally made some agonal movements, including swallowing and minor movements of an arm or leg. This is while CPR with external compression devices in progress. Initial rectal temperature was 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees centigrade. He appeared to have vomit on his uniform," end quote. Contrary to Armstrong's false statement to Steve, at no point do the medical records indicate that Tony sat up or that he had a heart attack while at the jail. Rather, the notes state pupils were initially fixed and dilated, but became responsive after CPR was initiated, and the patient remained in asystole, PE, and occasional VFib. No spontaneous pulse was ever palpated. The doctor's notes further state there was never any purposeful movement or response to pain. As quoted above, the doctor's notes state, "I am not sure what circumstances the patient was held in incarceration, but it is difficult to understand a rectal temperature of 72 degrees Fahrenheit while someone is incarcerated in jail. The cause of his hypothermia is not clear. It is possible he had an underlying medical condition resulting in hypothermia. I do not know if he could have been exposed to a cold environment. I do believe that hypothermia was the ultimate cause of his death." The heroic corrections officer who preserved the security camera footage after Tony's death last saw him alive at 6 a.m. on the morning of Wednesday, January 25th, 2022, when she went off her shift. At that time, Tony was awake and talkative in the isolation cell in the booking area and not in any evident distress. 72 degrees is approximately room temperature in the Walker County Jail. The only way for a living person's body temperature to fall to near room temperature and for the person to still be marginally alive, as indicated in the medical records, and not a corpse that has cooled to match the temperature of its surroundings, is for that person to have been exposed to frigid temperatures for an extended time. Based on these circumstances, it appears that Tony was strapped into a restraint chair during the night of January 25th to the 26th and placed in the jail kitchen's walk-in freezer or similar frigid environment for an extended time, possibly as punishment for deputies who had had a time with Tony, or as punishment for allegedly shooting at deputies. Security footage from the kitchen area still exists, showing what happened to Tony there during the night of the 25th to 26th. However, the heroic corrections officer who viewed and captured the security footage on her phone did not review footage from before 4 a.m., at which point Tony had already been returned to his isolation cell in the booking area, nor did she know to check the footage from the jail kitchen overnight. Denzel Mitchell was the jail supervisor on duty overnight from the 25th to the 26th. The other corrections officers on duty that night include Braxton Key, Bailey Gainey, Catherine Clegan, and Jacob Smith. Each of these corrections officers knows exactly what happened to Tony during that horrific night. Each of them was deliberately indifferent to his obvious serious medical needs. Each of them, at a minimum, failed to intervene in an act of horrific abuse committed by one or more of their fellow corrections officers. According to incident reports viewed by the correction officer who preserved the videos, Jacob Smith and Braxton Key claimed to have, quote unquote, found Tony unresponsive at feeding time around 4 a.m. The jail kitchen typically is opened at 3 a.m. to prepare food for the morning breakfast run. This means that after Tony was removed from the walk-in freezer or other frigid environment, at least 5 hours passed before he was transported to Walker County Medical Center, despite his obvious serious medical need for emergency medical treatment throughout that time. Hour by hour, Tony's chances of survival dwindled, as captured in a series of chilling surveillance videos preserved by a heroic corrections officer so that Tony's family would know what happened to him. The first video that the estate has from the morning of the 26th was captured at approximately 4 a.m. This is after Tony has been returned to the isolation cell in the booking area from the freezer or other frigid environment. The video shows Braxton Key leading Alicia Heron, the jail's nurse practitioner, to the holding cell in which Tony can be seen lying on the bare cement floor. Supervisor Denzel Mitchell is also present and supervising. At various points, Key and Mitchell can be seen clowning and laughing as Tony lies motionless and naked on the bare cement floor in the open cell behind them, obviously in severe medical distress and in need of immediate emergency medical treatment. Let me make this a little bigger for you. You can see him. See the supervisor over here laughing. The guy checking in on him's laughing. They're just kind of do-la-la over here, not doing much of anything. Alicia Heron, the jail nurse practitioner, enters the cell and spends a minute or two inside with Tony, but appears to provide no medical treatment and does not summon an ambulance, even though Tony's severe medical distress is obvious. At the end of this first video, from around 4 a.m., Tony, lying naked among what appears to be piles of trash on the floor of the isolation cell, can be seen raising his head, peering out at deputies as if pleading for help. But Braxton Key closes the door of the cell and turns out the light, leaving Tony alone in the dark. And there's another picture of him. And what they're talking about trash is everything you can kind of see on this floor around his head. I'm not sure what it is, but they say it's trash. Now remember, he's not in an actual jail cell. He's just in a holding cell where he has no bathroom, toilet, bed, or anything in there. The next video provided to the estate appears to have been taken around the time of the 6 a.m. shift change. Now it shows Deputy Shoemaker opening the door of the cell and peering inside. In a subsequent video from around the same time, Shoemaker and Morgan Madison can be seen entering the cell with a sleeping mat. The morning of January 26th, as Tony lay dying of hypothermia, appears to be the first time he was provided any kind of padding to lay down on during his 2 weeks of incarceration. Prior to this, he had only had the bare concrete floor of the isolation cell. In this video, taken between 6 and 7 a.m., Nurse Brad Allred stands at the door of the cell looking in at Tony, but provides no medical treatment, though Tony's need for emergency medical intervention is obvious. Instead of calling an ambulance or providing Tony with medical attention, Benjamin Shoemaker and Morgan Madison focus their energies on sweeping trash out of the cell, in which the lights are now turned off, and cleaning it, evidently sweeping or mopping around Tony as he lies dying on the floor, removing signs of the squalor in which Tony was forced to spend his final days. I'm assuming all of you can also see what they're talking about. In a subsequent video taken that morning, Shoemaker and Madison can be seen entering the cell where the lights have now been turned on. Josh Jones stands outside the cell looking in. Haley Tidwell, the daughter of Captain Alicia Jotty Tidwell, also stands looking in at Tony. Captain Tidwell, wearing a black shirt, is also present and spends several minutes inside the cell. A female nurse, as yet unidentified, stands at the door of the cell looking in, but does not enter. The video subsequently shows Morgan Madison entering the cell carrying an orange jail uniform. This likely occurs at approximately 7:45 a.m. Brad Allred, the nurse, can be seen passing with the pill cart. None of these individuals calls an ambulance or otherwise takes steps to provide Tony with the immediate emergency medical treatment he so obviously needs. In the penultimate video taken around 8:30 a.m., Shoemaker rolls a wheelchair into the cell. Shoemaker, with the help of either Forley or Holzman, then brings Tony out of the cell in the wheelchair. For the first time in any of these videos taken over 2 weeks of detention, Tony is now dressed. Deputies have placed an orange jail uniform on him. Tony's body falls out of the wheelchair outside the cell. The deputies lift him back into it. Deputies can be seen shackling Tony's feet as his body makes slow, seemingly spasmodic movements. Tony is still alive at this point. After initially placing him in the chair, deputies pick Tony up and drag him back inside the cell, evidently to conceal his presence, as a new female detainee is brought into the booking area and processed, further delaying Tony's access to the emergency medical treatment he obviously urgently requires. Again, none of the deputies, Shoemaker, Wakefield, Forley, or Holzman, calls for an ambulance. And here you can see him just sliding right out of that wheelchair. Even after the female detainee has been processed, Shoemaker, Wakefield, Forley, and Holzman show no urgency, but stand around talking outside the closed cell door for a while. At long last, the 4 deputies finally bring Tony out again and carry him through the door to the Sallyport to place him in the Sheriff's Department SUV for transport to the hospital, as described above. And there's another picture of them putting him in the wheelchair. Again, I'll give you guys a moment to take a look at that. By the time deputies arrived with Tony at the hospital at 9:23 a.m., over 5 hours after deputies first were captured on video laughing and joking while Tony lay naked on the cement floor of a cell in obvious need of emergency medical treatment. He had no pulse and only agonal respirations of 2 to 4 breaths per minute. Deputies did not inform hospital staff that Tony had been placed in a freezer or other frigid environment or that he was hypothermic. Doctors learned Tony was hypothermic only when they took his temperature after beginning emergency resuscitation efforts. Learning that Tony was hypothermic caused physicians to immediately change their course of treatment, as the measures they had initially employed were inappropriate to resuscitate a person who is severely hypothermic. Despite the heroic efforts of emergency medical personnel at Walker Baptist Hospital to warm Tony's body and over 3 hours of continual attempts to resuscitate him, Tony was pronounced dead at 1:15 p.m. that afternoon. Now, this goes on to say the sheriff has a policy or practice of deliberate indifference to serious medical needs and excessive and unreasonable force. The sheriff has a policy or practice of deliberate indifference to the serious medical needs of those incarcerated in its jail, and a policy or practice of using excessive force and inflicting unnecessary physical harm on inmates housed there. As a further example of the policies or practice of deliberate indifference to medical needs at the jail, a woman named Autumn Harris passed away in the Walker County Jail on December 5th, 2018, of untreated pneumonia, after being incarcerated for 22 days without corrections officers obtaining emergency medical treatment. As an example of the policy or practice of using excessive force, inflicting unnecessary and even sadistic harm on inmates housed there, a video obtained by the individual who preserved the videos of what happened to Tony shows the use of unnecessary and unreasonable force against another inmate, Jamal Scott. The video depicts an officer, defendant Richard Holzman, using his fist to strike an inmate who was handcuffed and under officers' complete control after the inmate had been sprayed with chemical irritant, beaten with a baton, and was bleeding profusely. And this is screenshots of that video that occurred. In this one over here, you can certainly see what appears to be quite a bit of blood. And an even further example of policy or practice, an inmate named Hollis Chadwick Smith filed a January 17, 2023 habeas corpus petition alleging that Jacob Smith and Denzel Mitchell, quote, sexually assaulted me by punching me in the penis, and Sergeant Mitchell Crabb, my penis twisted as CO kicked me in my anal butt. End of quotes. In a further example of a policy or practice, Hollis Chadwick Smith filed a second February 8, 2023 habeas corpus petition alleging that, quote, I have cancer and was stated to make up with oncology, been locked up 2 months, medical refuses treatment, and complaining that he is losing weight, can't hardly walk, can't eat, dying. Sheriff Nick Smith and Communications Officer TJ Armstrong participated in the scheme to deny Tony's constitutional rights and ratified the conduct of the deputies who violated Tony's constitutional rights by issuing a false statement to the news media regarding Tony's death, quoting in part in news media as follows, quote, on Thursday, January 27th, an inmate in the Walker County Jail was provided a routine medical check by jail medical staff. Medical staff determined the inmate needed to be transported to the hospital for further evaluation. The inmate was alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital. Shortly after arrival at the hospital, the inmate suffered a medical emergency and became unresponsive. Life-saving efforts were performed by hospital staff, and the inmate was ultimately revived. Unfortunately, a short time later, the inmate passed away. They were sure trying to do damage control, weren't they? Armstrong also participated in the scheme to deny Tony's constitutional rights by giving false information to the family about his condition. including telling Tony's cousin Steve that when deputies got Tony to the hospital, the doctor had asked Tony to sit up, and Tony had sat up, and that at this point he had had a massive heart attack, but that for now they were keeping him alive. Sheriff Nick Smith, investigator Carl Carpenter, and TJ Armstrong participated in the scheme to deny Tony's constitutional rights and ratified the conduct of the deputies who violated those rights by investigating the corrections officer who preserved the video of Tony being carried into the Sally Port, along with the other videos referenced above, and by retaliating against that person by interrogating her, confiscating her phone, and imaging its contents, suspending her, terminating her employment for allegedly leaking the video, contradicting Armstrong's statement, and sending an officer to intimidate her. The remainder of the named defendants participated in the scheme by delaying seeking medical treatment and failing to intervene for nearly 5 hours as Tony lay dying on the concrete floor of the cell, ensuring that Tony did not survive to tell the story of what happened to him. And the sheriff, Nick Smith, ratified the conduct of Morgan Madison by selecting him as the Corrections Officer of the Month immediately after these events. As discussed above, corrections officers on duty during the overnight shift from January 25th to 26th intentionally exposed Tony to frigid temperatures for a substantial period of time during the night of January 25th to the 26th, most likely by placing him in a restraint chair in the jail's kitchen's walk-in freezer or similar frigid environment and leaving him there for hours. The severity and duration of the exposure to the extreme cold temperature sufficient to lower Tony's body temperature to 72 degrees Fahrenheit or lower represented a substantial risk of harm to Tony's safety and health, violating his substantive due process rights as a pretrial detainee under the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. The corrections officers acted with deliberate indifference and malice in intentionally exposing Tony to such conditions. Denzel Mitchell was the jail supervisor on duty overnight from the 25th to the 26th. The other corrections officers on duty that night include Braxton Key, Bailey Gainey, Catherine Clegan, and Jacob Smith. To the extent that each of these defendants did not actively participate in intentionally exposing Tony to frigid temperatures for a substantial period of time during the night of the 25th to 26th, each is liable for failure to intervene to stop the violation. Each had the opportunity to intervene and summon an ambulance to take Tony to the emergency room at a time when such intervention would still have been effective. Now, Bailey Gainey, Catherine Clegan, Jacob Smith, Jeremy Farley, Richard Holzman, Benjamin Shoemaker, Dayton Wakefield, nurse practitioner Alicia Heron, and nurse Brad Allred are liable for being deliberately indifferent to Tony's obvious serious medical need for immediate emergency medical assistance by failing to call an ambulance and failing to intervene in the nearly 5 hours when Tony lay dying of hypothermia on the floor of the isolation cell in the booking area. Each had the opportunity to intervene and summon an ambulance to take Tony to the emergency room at a time when such intervention would still have been effective. And it goes on to say that TJ Armstrong participated in the scheme by issuing a false statement to the news media regarding Tony's death, quoting in part that on Thursday, January 27th, an inmate in the Walker County Jail was provided a routine medical check by jail medical staff. Medical staff determined the inmate needed to be transported to the hospital for further evaluation. The inmate was alert and conscious when he left the facility and arrived at the hospital. Shortly after arrival at the hospital, the inmate suffered a medical emergency and became unresponsive. Life-saving efforts were performed by hospital staff, and the inmate was ultimately revived. Unfortunately, a short time later, the inmate passed away. Did I go back up? I think I'd gone back up. So this goes on to say that the sheriff's office has established a policy, practice, and or custom of improperly training, retraining, instruction, supervising, disciplining, and or allowing or encouraging its corrections officers to administer the Walker County Jail without regard to the constitutional rights of detainees housed there to be free of excessive and or gratuitous force or gratuitous and or sadistic infliction of pain, and to receive prompt medical treatment for their serious medical needs, including but not limited to emergency medical treatment and transport to the emergency room. Due to these policies, practice, and or customs, medical needs are tolerated by the sheriff and his deputies, and the sheriff has a policy or practice of covering up such acts of misconduct rather than disciplining the officers involved. As such, officers believe they were free to engage in such acts and ignore serious medical needs without regard to the rights of detainees at the jail and without any fear of consequences or discipline. The above described policies, practices, and customs demonstrate deliberate indifference by the sheriff toward the rights of individuals in custody in general, including but not limited to Tony. The above described policies, practices, customs, and deliberate indifference of the sheriff were the moving force that directly and proximately caused Tony's death. And then the request for relief is to punish all the defendants and attorney's fees, litigation costs, that kind of thing. So let me go back and see for anybody that didn't see it earlier. This was Tony when he was arrested. He had black spray paint all over his face because he was preparing to go to a portal to find his baby brother that he felt was in a box in a house because Tony was on pretty bad drugs. And one more time, let me see if I can find the video. Let's see if.
County Sheriff's Office on
See if I
January
put it at the
12th
right
and
spot.
died just 2 weeks later.
Seeing a man that
There
I
it
grew up
is.
with, and I can remember playing
They
basketball
say
and
he's
laughing
alert and
with,
conscious
seeing him
at this
drag across
point.
the frozen floor, lifeless. It just changed something in my heart.
A lawsuit alleges he died from hypothermia after being placed inside a freezer at the jail.
The only thing they know to do is throw you in a cell and make a
They are
lesson out of you, I
laughing.
guess is what they're
There
trying
he
to
is
do
with
here.
the trash
Now
all
people
around
are
him.
calling for change.
Go forward, there has to be
Now,
some
I
kind
did
of
just
change.
find this earlier today. Let's see. All right. So this was today, actually. Guards at an Alabama jail intentionally blew freezing air into a man's cell until he became hypothermic and later died, a lawsuit alleges. Now, this is the first update I have seen since everything I just shared with you. And so I guess it alleges that the Alabama jail guards blew freezing air into his cell, that the staffers of the jail caused extremely cold air to blow into his cell, and that the man, Tony, was also deprived of water for 70 hours. 70. In the nights before inmate Anthony Mitchell's death, guards at an Alabama jail intentionally blew frigid air into the cell of the 33-year-old who later became hypothermic and died, a new document in a wrongful death lawsuit alleges. So there's been an amended complaint to this, and that was filed Monday by Mitchell's mother. And it states that the correction officers intentionally caused extremely cold air to blow through the roof vents of Mitchell's cell in the Walker County Jail on the nights of January 25th and 26th. And Mitchell was carried out of a cell on January 26th after being incarcerated for 14 days under hellish conditions, the lawsuit alleges. According to Monday's filing, the outside temperature on the nights he was in his cell was in the low 30s Fahrenheit, meaning if guards blew outside air into his cell, it would have been frigid. And the lawsuit alleges that the cell in which Tony Mitchell was held, BK5, is known among staffers and inmates as, quote unquote, the freezer, because of guards' ability to subject inmates to frigid temperatures there. The lawsuit alleges this would have been the coldest cell in the jail. And then again, we discussed this earlier, but that he was deprived of water for over 70 hours and he couldn't eat because his false teeth had been confiscated. The filing alleges that Mitchell became severely hypothermic overnight and into the morning hours after they deliberately exposed him to a frigid environment. The lawsuit says BK5, the cell he's in, lacks a water source, and therefore inmates can only access water if a member of the jail staff brings a cup of water or allows the inmate out of the cell to retrieve their own cup of water. If you remember, I told you earlier, the cell he's in over here is just a holding cell, and he was there for about 2 weeks. It had no toilet, no bed, no sink, nothing like that. The lawsuit said footage from the jail's booking room shows that Mitchell received his last cup of water around 4:30 a.m. on January 23rd and did not show him receiving any water or leaving the cell until he was carried out on the 26th. The lawsuit even said the footage showed Mitchell holding his cup to the window of his cell, apparently asking for water, but not receiving it. And we remember one of the corrections officers that worked there did video and capture all this on her phone and turned it over. She was fired for those actions. Mitchell was kept in BK5, an isolation cell in the jail's booking area, between the 12th and the 26th. His cell lacked a bed or anything else to sleep on and only had a drain in the floor for a toilet, according to the lawsuit. Again, jail staff also took his false teeth on January 15th following an incident in which he was shocked with a taser, leaving him without the ability to chew solid food for more than 10 days. Now, Monday's filing, and this would just be this past Monday, March 20th, 2023, is an updated account of what we just read in that complaint that Mitchell's mother, Margaret Mitchell, alleges her son experienced in jail. And she originally brought that lawsuit against the jail and its guards last month. This was filed on February 13th, 2023. So, what do you guys think of this? It's pretty crazy. It's pretty sad. I can't imagine being his mom. And my gosh, look at how good he looked before drugs took over him. It's heartbreaking. Very heartbreaking. So, I really appreciate you all joining me. Please give this video a thumbs up. If you haven't yet subscribed, I would love to have you a subscriber. And I would also love to have you become a new channel member. Let me know what you think in the chat here for a few minutes. And put comments below the video. I always read every single one of them, and I try to respond to as many as I possibly can. Again, I truly appreciate every single one of you for being here, for listening to Tony's story. Please share it, and I'll be following it. I'll see you guys later.